It's an honor and pleasure to introduce our next guest speaker. And let me tell you a little bit of what happened when I mentioned his name. The class erupted by hearing his name. You gotta be kidding. Is he coming to our peace conference? Hearing his name is special to the students. After all, they experienced this semester of empowerment by reading a textbook written by him and seeing documentaries that he was executive producer of them. They heard of Gandhi freeing India from years of imperialism, but they didn't know how exactly he did it. They had heard about civil rights movements, but they thought Martin Luther King and a couple of guys got together and made it happen. They had never heard that actually hours, weeks, and months of training led by Reverend Jim Lawson in the basement of a small church, the courage of young African-American students, their commitment to learn and practice the strategy, tactics, and methods of nonviolence actually desegregated the South. They learned students their age in Yugoslavia, called Alpor, became an army of human rights and pro-democracy activists who systematically brought down a dictator. They learned that nonviolence works, even against the most ruthless dictators. One after another case, they got inspired and learned about the power of nonviolence. They no longer thought that nonviolence is weak or unrealistic concept. They broke away from conventional thinking and learned that peace and nonviolence is a realistic matter. His name is Jack DuVall. He's the president of the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict. He was executive producer of a documentary called A Force More Powerful, which has been seen in over 80 countries and translated into more than 10 languages, and was also a co-author of the book with the same name. He has spoken at the universities and policy institutes, including Princeton University, Stanford University, Harvard Divinity School, the University of Sydney, Australia, and Carnegie Council on Ethics and International Affairs, the Palestinian Center, and the Justice Institute of British Columbia. He has also appeared on BBC, MSNBC, CBC Canada, and his articles have appeared in the International Herald Tribune, Le Monde, and many other periodicals. In this speech, Mr. DuVall will discuss how the growing use of civil resistance in nonviolent struggle for basic rights around the world is enabling ordinary people to make their voice heard, achieve genuine democracy with self-determination, and secure equal rights for women, indigenous people, and others who have been oppressed or subordinated. He'll also explain how the choice of civil resistance as a method of conflict can diminish political violence and create political and social conditions that are consistent with real peace. So please welcome Mr. Jack DuVall and listen to his speech on civil resistance and curtailing violence conflict.
Thank you, Fran. I met Fran a year ago at a conference in Cleveland, Ohio, for educators interested in learning about how to teach nonviolent action, which my organization helped to put on. And so those of you here at Golden West College have someone who is very intellectually oriented to an understanding of this subject. And I have to tell you that the number of such people around the world is unfortunately fairly thinly distributed, so you're very lucky to have her at Golden West. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm actually a native of Southern California. Grew up here, although I've been in the East for many years, and it's always nice to be back. I've never, however, been to the campus of Golden West, so this is a first. So it's a new look at a place that is very familiar to me in terms of the climate and the surroundings. The talk that I want to give today is in the context of your looking at peace and nonviolence, but it's going to be a talk about agency rather than structure. Now, some of you may know that that's a big debate in the academic world. What defines the circumstances under which we can have any kind of political or social change? Is it the structure of conditions we're facing? And so then we have to figure out how we modify this structure or blow it up? Or does change come from those who have a strategy to seek that change, which is where agency comes in? That's one of the ways in which you can, I want to reframe the question of peace from difficulties you look at and outcomes that you wish, and look instead at an alternative way to arrive at that same destination. So the question or the subject or the topic that I bring to you is civil resistance. And just what is civil resistance? Very simple. It's a way to fight for your rights. It's a way to engage in a struggle for justice. It's a way to seek and obtain self-determination. If you're a minority whose rights aren't honored, or if you're the members of an entire nation and you don't have your own state, like the Palestinians or the Sahrawis in Western Sahara or the West Papuans in Indonesia. And it's a method to seek those rights and to establish justice other than by using violent methods. And as we'll see a little bit later, it happens to be a much more effective method of obtaining rights or justice. Now, if you can't have peace unless you reduce or eliminate violence, then civil resistance, which is a way of obtaining rights and justice, is clearly a way of producing peace. And peace, real peace, clearly, as we'll find, requires actually the very things that civil resistance is good at producing. But let me just provoke you a little bit by asking you some questions about what you think peace really means. Is it simply the absence of conflict? No. Is it effectively a negative state? There is no violence here. There is no conflict here. So is that peace? Is peace possible while you're living under oppression? While you can be arrested and thrown into jail and tortured? Is that peace? There may not be any violence in that society, but is that peace? If so, it's the peace of the silent. Is it possible to live in a condition that you could call peace if you have no rights and if there is no justice? What sort of peace would that be? Is peace delivered by people who have great ideas and political power on the world stage, by diplomats and presidents? Is it top down? Is that the way you get it? Is that the only way you can get it? Is that even the primary way you can get it? Or is it, in addition, or perhaps even to a large extent instead, something that is produced by action that happens from the bottom up? Because civil resistance is undertaken by people at the bottom, not at the top. That idea, by the way, is extremely difficult for policymakers and the news media to understand, because they're obsessed with the idea that all good things descend from above. And is peace a matter of behavior, or is it something that can actually be summoned and developed through politics, through political and social action? All of the great movements using nonviolent action in the last 100 years used political and social action. Many of my friends who have a principled attachment to nonviolence and are seeking peace, and who absolutely insist that there won't be peace in the world unless every person makes a moral decision to embrace peace, may be right, although I don't agree with them. But I sometimes tell them, Good luck. I hope you're successful. You'll have to go door to door, and we have 6 billion people in the world. If you want to change their behavior from a proclivity to violence or conflict to a proclivity for peace and nonviolence. There may be other ways that engage larger numbers of people in the process of accomplishing political and social change that diminishes the conditions that we associate with the opposite of peace. And this man, Frederick Douglass, the great African-American abolitionist who lived before, during, and after the Civil War in the 19th century, had an intuitive understanding of that. And when he offered his definition of civil resistance, still a very good definition today, more than 150 years later, he started with the word power. And he said, power, let's think of power as something that's potentially violent or oppressive, power concedes nothing, and it never will. Find out just what any people will quietly submit to, and you found out the exact measure of injustice and wrong which will be imposed on them. And these conditions will continue until they're resisted. The limits of tyrants, the limits of those who bring violence, the limits of those who do oppression, the limits of those who hold people in some sort of subjection, the limits of those authorities are prescribed, are set by the endurance of those whom they oppress, the unwillingness of those who they oppress to resist. This is the fundamental insight in the use of power by those who would appear structurally not to have power that can be developed in a society to fight for the rights and the justice and the fairness and the equality under law that are the conditions we associate with having a form of constructive peace. Now, Frederick Douglass was the first black man to be invited to the White House, and this President Abraham Lincoln was the one who invited him. And even before he became president, Lincoln showed that he had the same intuitive sense of the opportunity for a different form of power to be exercised. When he said on the floor of the Congress, when he was a congressman in 1848, any people, anywhere, being inclined and having the power, that word again, power, have the right to rise up and shake off the existing government and form a new one that suits them better. I mean, you can rise up if you just want a new government that suits you better. What a sweeping concept of the right of resistance or the right to rise up. 50 years after that, the great Russian novelist and fighter against the military draft in his country, Leo Tolstoy, also had an intuitive understanding of this kind of power that could lead to different political and social conditions. He went so far as to predict that public opinion, which, and by the way, he didn't mean public opinion taking polls, I'm for this guy, I'm for that guy. He meant the total body of opinion and sentiment and preference and values in the society. That public opinion would eventually change the whole structure of human life, and that would make violence superfluous. Look at that word, superfluous, unnecessary. Who cares about it? He predicted that violence would disappear, not because we were fighting with violent people, necessarily, but because it would become completely unnecessary. People would come to the point of believing that it really had no further place in the contests and the conflicts and the struggles that would be going on politically, socially for quite some time. Gandhi was very influenced by Leo Tolstoy. He said he was overwhelmed by Tolstoy's thinking. And in his work as a lawyer in South Africa, before he returned to his native India, campaigning for the rights of Indian South Africans and other people of color in South Africa, he read voraciously newspapers about struggles all over the world, including Irish resistance to British rule, Rent strikes were a major nonviolent tactic used by the Irish. He read particularly about the uprising of the Russian people in 1905 against the rule of the Tsar, which produced Russia's first elected parliament, the Duma. Marches, strikes, mass demonstrations all over Russia for a year rocked the Tsarist government back on its heels. Gandhi found this fascinating, and he applied these ideas in South Africa. And then when he went back to India, organizing campaigns of non-cooperation and civil disobedience, he imposed the first serious costs on the British colonial overlords in India that they ever had. And the British had been challenged by terrorists and violent insurrectionists for almost a century. Didn't really challenge their hold on power in India. It was Gandhi who did that with a completely different set of methods. To the point that one of the chief British officials in the 1930s, witnessing Gandhi's salt march and civil disobedience to resist the payment by Indians of taxes on salt, came to the conclusion, as he put it, England can hold India only by consent. We can't rule it by the sword. In other words, effective control of India, British exploitation of India, sucking the value out of the country for their colonial benefit. That was possible only if the Indian people went quietly along with that setup. Once the Indian people in sufficient numbers found ways to resist and to disrupt British rule, the value of being there in the first place to the British would substantially decline. So Gandhi was really the first historical figure in the modern period, and on a mass basis at any time in history, the first person who developed a new way to rise up, rather than through violent revolution, terrorism, or some usually violent way of resisting oppression. And he called the tactics that he used nonviolent weapons. He saw it as a form of conflict. Mass marches and protests, refusal to pay taxes, boycotts, resignations, active interference with the operations of the British control of India in order to be able to demonstrate to the British that what they had set up wasn't going to work anymore. And the message that everyone involved in administering British control of India was, it's over. This isn't going to work any longer. You're going to have to find a new way of holding control of India. The tactics of resistance that Gandhi pioneered and that have been extended into hundreds and hundreds of tactics of nonviolent resistance to oppression fall into three general categories. This is a categorization that was developed by the great American scholar of nonviolent action, Gene Sharp. Tactics of protest and persuasion. This is what the media sees. By the way, the news media report all nonviolent action as protest. They don't see anything except a mass march. Everything else that's going on, which may be more important, they don't see. So most mainstream news reports about nonviolent action are untrustworthy because they don't understand what they're looking at. But tactics of protest and persuasion we're all familiar with. Petitions, symbols, vigils, marches, walkouts, physical action which say, I'm not participating in this any longer, and we're exhibiting our opposition, our objection, in principle and in practice to these forms of denying us our rights. Then there are tactics of non-cooperation, in which you do nothing. And this is usually what happens when a movement or a campaign begins, because particularly under a dictator or a repressive government, if the first thing you do is you go out and you march in the street, you might get beaten up and thrown in jail. And worse things, that will maybe gunned down. But tactics of non-cooperation involve much lower physical risk. This is where the strategy comes in. You have to compare tactics based on risks and costs that you are going to pay in relation to the cost you're going to impose on your repressive opponent. Civil disobedience is something that you don't do. It's not something that you do. So tactics can be inaction, can represent constructive inaction. And then there are tactics of direct intervention, blockade, seizures, and the most controversial tactic, which is sabotage, actually physically destroying something that's important to an oppressive state without harming a human being. A lot of debate about whether that's nonviolent or isn't, debate that goes on today. So when you're applying all these tactics in the form of a campaign or a movement to represent your cause, to seek certain goals and objectives, when your opponent is someone who wants to deny you those rights, wants to preserve the existing situation because they're getting value out of controlling the country, as the British did of India, how can you sum up the dynamic of this conflict? Really the dynamic that engaging in civil resistance triggers. I think these are the key parts of it. When people deprive an oppressor, somebody who's denying you your rights, when people deprive the oppressor of their consent, when they say, we don't recognize you as having authority over us any longer, we don't recognize you as governing on our behalf, that reduces the legitimacy of the person who possesses political power at that time. And then people begin to say, maybe this guy isn't so good, maybe this setup isn't really fair. Legitimacy is what is put at issue. A very potent political attribute which helps rulers, which helps people who control the conditions of life to remain in power and to make people acquiesce to them. Once legitimacy goes down, everybody in the society starts questioning whether this whole setup makes any sense. And then when enough people refuse to cooperate, when they don't pay taxes, when they won't go to work, when they engage in a general strike, they increase the economic costs of holding control. The oppressive setup begins to not make any economic sense any longer. The people who are extracting value out of that oppressive setup realize their income is going down. And then the people who carry out their orders begin to worry too. Well, let's see, we're working overtime, we're not getting paid anymore. How are we going, is this going to last? What's going on here? This is the dynamic that civil resistance triggers. This is why we call it nonviolent conflict. And so when the legitimacy of the system goes down, and when the costs of the existing system goes up, everybody who's enforcing it begins to doubt whether it can last. And at that point, that's the tipping point where it becomes clear to everybody who's observing or participating in this system that it's going to change, and that is not going substantial changes in the offing. The record historically of the use of civil resistance at the national level, the level of nation states, is enormous. The Indian conflict that I mentioned to you, a wonderful case of a civil general strike which brought down a Salvadoran dictator in 1944, the civil rights movement in the United States in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, the resistance to the Argentine junta in the 1970s and 80s. These are all successful uses of civil resistance, by the way. The resistance to the dictator Augusto Pinochet in Chile in the 1980s, the work of the Solidarity movement in Poland to accomplish a nonviolent transformation out of communism in the late 80s in that country, the people power movement in the Philippines in 1986, which gave us that term people power, the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia in the late 1980s, and the other changes in communist countries in 1989, such as in East Germany, in Mongolia, a wonderful nonviolent revolution that occurred in the African country of Mali in 1991. By the way, this is just the tip of the iceberg. There are dozens and dozens of these successful nonviolent transitions. The Russian people's resistance to an attempted military coup in 1991, the enormous transformation in South Africa, the anti-apartheid movement from the early 70s until the early 90s, predominantly nonviolent, and then the so-called color revolutions in Serbia, Georgia, and Ukraine, in which authoritarian governments gave way to elected governments. This is a stunning record of success in delivering rights and justice and self-determination to people who rely primarily or exclusively on nonviolent means, on civil resistance. So just summing all this up in the last few decades, in the 35 years between 1970 and 2005, there were 67 countries that went through a transition from authoritarian government being run by a dictator to a democratic government. And in 50 of these 67 transitions, the pivotal force, the agency, was some nonviolent coalition of civic groups that engaged in the kinds of nonviolent tactics I've discussed with you to put pressure on the oppressive system and to dissolve it. It was the fundamental way in which this wave of democracy in the last 30 years of the 19th century was successful, giving us these great triumphs of people power that, of course, have transformed the world. It's not too great a statement to make. We've seen these transformations on television. We see the final act. We see the million people in the square. We see Martin Luther King, films of him addressing the vast audience at the Lincoln Memorial in 1963. And so these great panoramas show us that there are millions of people in these societies who aren't just benefiting from these changes, they're participating in these changes. They provide the power that makes these transitions successful. So you would think, wouldn't you, that if you were the participant in a nonviolent struggle, if you had worked in the civil rights movement in the United States, starting in the mid-1950s, and staying with this even beyond the acquisition of greater political rights in the mid-1960s, that it might actually affect you as an individual participant. And it affects you as an individual participant, then it's affecting tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of people. Does that actually change a country? It does. And there are a number of what I call emergent properties in the society which come to the fore. These movements using civil resistance change the people and the societies that are undergoing this political transition. And I just want to acquaint you with a few of these properties. The first and most important of them is that movements using civil resistance exhibit to you or model or show you an example of the power of reason. You cannot persuade someone to join a nonviolent movement unless you give them an argument about what it stands for, why it will work potentially as a movement, and then how the country will be better off. That means that you have to respect the mind of the people that you're trying to recruit and mobilize into the movement. There's also no such thing as a dictator of a nonviolent movement. Everybody has responsibilities. Everybody has the opportunity to initiate action. That requires creative thinking at all levels. So this is persuasion and not coercion. People can't be coerced into taking risks and joining a nonviolent movement. What you're telling people to get them to participate has to be honest. You have to be credible. These are the same skills you need to run a successful democracy, which is one of the reasons why the vast majority of countries that have gone through a transition from dictatorship to democracy in a nonviolent way stay a democracy. They don't revert because the people change. They understand. And one of the main reasons is because they've absorbed, they've begun to understand this has to be a rational process. I have to be willing, I have to develop the faculties of being able to think critically and to speak honestly and fully and sincerely to the people I expect to follow me. This is what it takes to do a successful democracy. And by the way, when democracies degrade, when countries lose their democracies, the first thing that is induced by an internal opponent is the loss of reason. When you lose reason, when you lose the capacity for rational thought and analysis, it's the first step to losing democracy. The second interesting property, I think, that's implicit in this is self-rule. The Hindu word for self-rule is swaraj, and it means, am I ruling myself? Can I discipline myself? Can I bring order to my life? Gandhi would say to Indians, how do you expect to rule your country if you can't rule yourself? You have to start with yourself. We don't have the right to rule our country until we learn how to rule ourselves. So when a campaign would start to deteriorate and become violent, Gandhi would call it off. He would say, we have to go back to the village and dig latrines. We have to learn to do something constructive. This is something constructive that we are doing. So a movement, to be mobilized effectively, requires self-reliance, requires planning, it requires discipline. And the most important form of discipline that it requires is nonviolent discipline. Because once you become violent, you give an excuse for your opponent to use violence against you. And then the whole dynamic that I've been discussing disappears. And you're not able to accomplish change that way any longer. Self-rule, self-reliance. We are going to govern ourselves is the essence of democracy. It's the essence of freedom. There's no such thing as an irresponsible exercise of freedom in which freedom lasts in the society for very long. Another property, socially, in the use of civil resistance as a way to accomplish change. Another property, another political and social reality which emerges in the society as a result of the action of these movements is representation. You can't organize a movement unless it represents what the people in that movement want. You can't impose your ideas on the movement. People who you're asking to join a movement, you have to persuade them that their grievances, their problems, their discontent is the reason for the movement in the first place. To do that, you have to talk with them. You have to ascertain what's bothering them. You have to represent them. You have to listen to them. Before Gandhi started a single campaign in India, he went around India, took the trains, which the British had thoughtfully built, in their control of the country over the previous 100 years. Gandhi put those trains to very good use. He went around the country and he talked to people. You know, what kind of a country do you want? What are the conditions of people in this country? He listened to people. You have to delegate authority. You have to invite participation. In order to be able to do that effectively, you have to have some sense of humility. You can't just start barking on orders in a nonviolent movement. You have to come to people with an honest proposition about what you believe, hear what they say about it, and then incorporate their ideas in the proposition that you generalize for change for the country as a whole. And this breeds solidarity. This is a process in which there are not single heroes. When the change occurred in Chile and Pinochet stepped down from being president after millions of people had participated in one way or another in a movement to enforce the honesty of a plebiscite that Pinochet himself had called, the leader of the coalition afterwards said, how many Chileans today could say that they did this change? 7 million could say that they did this change. The single most untruthful political poster in what it represents in the 20th century was that famous poster of Che Guevara, because it makes you assume that change is occurring because of one person. That never happens. It's a complete myth. And the greatest representation of that myth are all these dozens and dozens of nonviolent transitions from oppression to freedom in the last 100 years accomplished by mass movements in which, as the Chilean gentleman said, 7 million people were the heroes in this change. We remember Martin Luther King Jr. because he was the recognized leader of the civil rights movement, but he would have been the first to tell you that if he'd been the only voice, it never would have succeeded. Every single person in a demonstration was a stakeholder in that change. That's what breeds resilience. Everybody has a part. Everybody knows they have a part. The picture here is of Fannie Lou Hamer, a great partisan and organizer in the civil rights movement. She did voter registration drives in Mississippi. Once coming back from a late night meeting, she was pulled over by the sheriff in the county she was driving to, pulled out of her car and beaten almost to death, and was in the hospital for 30 days. And on the 31st day, she went out and started another voter registration drive. One of her colleagues, who's an acquaintance of mine, the Reverend James Lawson, of that period said, what was it that made people able to do that? They came to the view, they had all come to the view, that if they continued in the movement, it would succeed. And if they personally dropped out, it would fail. For them, it was an existential matter. my life won't change unless I give my life to this movement. And the country will not change unless this movement is successful. That means my country won't change unless I stay in this movement. That's resilience. We see that represented sometimes in sports events and contests. We all have, probably I'm sure there are people in this room who have been part of a championship winning sports team, or at least the winning of a very important game. And you know individuals who go out there and they do not give up. They wait until the final moment. They give it their all. That's what people in these movements are capable of. It becomes a matter, they have faith that they will be successful if they stay at it. That's what brings about a transformation in a country. The people change, and thus the country changes. They become the agents of their own liberation. To do that, you have to recognize that the people that you are changing include the people who have been oppressing you. You don't have to like them. You don't have to have coffee with them after the change occurs. But you have to recognize that there will come a moment when they're no longer your enemy. That, in fact, helps them to defect from the other side. Everyone, as I said, becomes a stakeholder in this. And what that does is the very methods you use to produce the change become the methods that you need to have to sustain the new society. The means you use are reflected in the ends. So when Gandhi and most of the other great nonviolent leaders of movements would say, we have to use, the means we use have to be consistent with the ends we want. They weren't just saying that because it was a nice idea. It was essential to change the society, to use different methods of producing change. And therein lies the truth of the great saying, which a lot of individuals have said, which is to say that if you take power by the sword, you have to rule by the sword. If you take power in a different way, there's a different way of exercising power. The individual who understood this the best about why resistance changes everything, I think, was Václav Havel, who in his book Disturbing the Peace, Disturbing the Silent Peace of Oppression, he said, by breaking the rules of the game, the individual dissident, the individual protester, the individual nonviolent actor disrupts the game. He shatters the world of appearances, which is that this game helps people. He shows everyone that it's possible to live within the truth. The truth being that the society as it is broken, is oppressing people. Living within the lie that this is normal, that you can live without your rights and be normal, that kind of system, he said, can last only if it's universal, only if everyone believes the lie. And therefore, every single person who steps out of line, who becomes a dissident, denies the system in principle and threatens it in its entirety. And that is why dictators have to shoot the first dissident. That's why determined dictators prevent all opposition, because they know that the first person who objects is a threat to them. So if you are that first person, you have to see yourself as a threat to oppression. You already have power because you're seen by the oppressor as having potential power. So then the basis of resistance really is a choice of identity. The advent, the organizing of a nonviolent movement, which comes to you and asks you if you want to join it, really is presenting you with a question. And the question is, who are you? Are you the object of a ruling elite? Do you plan to be submissive to the threats of violence that will be used against you, or just to the social anesthesia that seems to prevail, in a semi-democratic or a democratic society where rights still may not be fully enforced? Or instead, are you a citizen? Is this really what it means to be a citizen? Are you able? Do you have the ability to resist the lie, and it is a lie, that injustice cannot be opposed? Are you able to develop nonviolent means to obtain power. History says that you do have that ability. History says that there isn't any condition in which you don't have the ability to resist, that it can be found, that space can be created. That there is no repression so severe that completely prevents you from being able to start unraveling the threads of the existing system. Today's movements around the world that use civil resistance are opposing corruption, social violence. There are campaigns for women's rights, for land reform, for indigenous tribal rights around the world, still for self-rule and self-determination, still for democracy, as in Iran and in the yet uncompleted change in Honduras. But there are still those who make an argument for political violence. They really have the attention of the news media still, don't they? And the first component of that argument is that violence is necessary, that it's the only way that you'll be liberated. We've already seen that isn't true. And so when we know that that isn't true, these kinds of statements really do sound pretty ridiculous. When Osama bin Laden said, "Oppression cannot be demolished except in a hail of bullets." Doesn't make much sense once you learn the history. Then they also argue that violence is virtuous. Somehow it's going to make you, Sartre said, when he admired the violent revolt against the French in Algeria, that the Algerians were becoming manly, they were becoming men. This is an old way of trying to justify violence. It's a way that you can demonstrate your masculinity. Lots of ways you can demonstrate your masculinity without being violent. And who said this statement, Osama bin Laden? Death is truth. He said, death is truth. This is a weakness of those who sell nonviolent, of those who sell violent resistance. This is why terrorists are almost always failures. Because death isn't popular. Most people don't want to die. Very few people in a society will participate in a violent insurrection or movement. Terrorists are a very lonely group, typically, socially. That may be why they, well, I won't get into that. But when I heard that phrase by Osama bin Laden, death is truth, it reminded me of something that Srđan Popović, a Serbian opposition leader, said when he was asked, well, why did people hate, Slobodan Milosevic so much? It wasn't a complete dictatorship. He said, the regime just it didn't know how not to lie. And it got to the point where their very language smelled like death. So a repressive dictator, very language smelled like death. This is a life or death choice. When you choose nonviolent means to resist oppression, whether you realize it or not, you are choosing life. You're affirming life. As this Iranian protester knew in the Green Movement last July, when after the regime had accused the Green Movement of being terrorists, she said, our people, we are not terrorists. That's what our government has become. Please tell the world how much we love life. She got it. She understood that central value that is exhibited by people who participate in nonviolent movements. We just want to be free, she said. There is in the world a demand for militant struggle. The question is, how will militants be developed? What kind of militants do you want? There are struggles for self-determination, an end to dictatorship, and an end to occupation. But here's the record summed up in a brand new study of 323 violent and nonviolent movements or insurrections in a 106-year period of time. This is the headline finding. Violent campaigns could be said to have succeeded in some way in about 26% of cases. May not have, the change produced may not have lasted, but the Bolshevik Revolution, Mao Zedong in China, Castro in Cuba, violent insurrection can sometimes work. We can get into debate about what it leads to. 26% of cases in that 106-year period of time. But nonviolent campaigns or movements succeeded in 53% of those cases. You have a better than 50-50 chance of succeeding with a nonviolent campaign or movement. What makes the difference? How good your strategy is. That's what my organization teaches. But the strategic conceptions that have to be embedded in the conduct of a nonviolent campaign or movement. So then how do we get to a state in which violent conflict in the world is subsiding? We rechannel resistance. The appeal of violence will go down as the people who have existential grievances find another way to seek freedom. The whole thing was summed up for me in one poster carried by a single protester in South Africa in 1986, standing by herself in front of a gas station on a street corner in Johannesburg. Her sign simply said, "To end violence, struggle for justice." She didn't say, the sign didn't say, "To end violence, be nonviolent as a matter of behavior." She said, she suggested by this side, to end violence in the society, we have to produce a society which gives us justice. She understood that struggling for justice, engaging in a campaign or a movement for justice would produce a society in which violence would subside. That not only applies to South Africa in the 1970s and 1980s, it applies to the world today on an international basis, as well as in any community or nation state in the world. If you want to produce a world characterized by peace, you have to focus on practical, concrete cases where you can help people seek their rights in depression. And if you do that, you'll also end the violence. Thank you. So, questions, objections, discussion, provocations? Yes, right here.
Actually, two questions. What is your advice to give movements that's been going on for a long time that's gotten too big to the point that they've broken up into subdivisions? So I've noticed there's a lot of inner fighting within certain struggles in the movement. And I don't know if on individual levels, you know how like the ACLU will have a problem and the other coalitions will have a problem. In the end, aren't we all trying to do something good?
Okay. Let me take it one at a time. Let me first respond to that. You're describing the common condition of a movement in an open society and in a democracy. Movements that have difficulty retaining their coherence, their unity, their sense of common purpose. And by the way, there are movements that are very diverse, and there are coalitions of many different kinds of groups that do manage to retain their unity, but the unity is applied to a strategy to seek certain specific goals. When you have a loss of unity, when there's fragmentation of a campaign or a movement, it may mean there are too many goals. There are too many specific, everybody has this list of 17 or 73 things you want to accomplish, and nobody can agree about all of these 17 things. That could be one reason. Another reason could be not enough people are being given ways to actively participate. Of course, we have to also know that we're talking about a campaign or a movement that's intended to use these various kinds of nonviolent tactics. That's what I'm talking about. I'm not just talking about an issue advocacy movement in which somebody goes on Facebook and says, I'm a fan of that group. That's not doing a movement. That's just expressing your preference. That's the same as answering a pollster's question. Campaigns and movements are about existential matters. They're about what will produce rights in our society. They're not about, well, this kind of healthcare reform is better than that kind of healthcare reform. That's traditional political action in which organizing and mobilizing is important, but it doesn't mean that you're doing strikes, boycotts, civil disobedience, marches, demonstrations, those kinds of. There's a gradient or a spectrum in the use of these nonviolent tactics from political advocacy to mass resistance. And what you're describing maybe the natural, organic dissolution of a movement that just has lost its sense of political focus or isn't giving enough people in the movement something to do. Your next question?
Secondly, what do you think about astroturfing? And do you think there's
I'm sorry, say again?
of astroturfing? Do you think there's more currently, or it's been going on since the beginning?
Sure, Putin does it all the time. Putin in Russia has paid for and set up various neo-fascist groups which, quote unquote, spontaneously create demonstrations supporting himself. Some dictators have gotten sophisticated about that. You have to do the research. It usually surfaces the truth. There is a lot of astroturfing of protests and rallies, no doubt about it. Yes? Oh, yes. It means when, this usually happens on the right more than on the left because there's typically in societies more money on the right than on the left. Privilege protects itself. That's just my personal opinion. But not my organization's opinion. We're strictly non-political. It means that when you raise money, you can pay people to come out to your demonstration, or you provide funding for lots of signs, for sandwiches, for all the things that might attract people who have a less existential commitment to the cause, but might just notionally think this is a nice idea. Paid political rallies. You pay people basically to come to rallies. It's an old practice conventionally. I mean, good organizing and mobilizing substitutes for this. If you don't have deep and wide organizing, it's really difficult to produce a lot of people at a rally or a campaign. I think there's a limit to the extent to, I don't think you can astroturf 500,000 people. If 500,000 people are showing up, if 25,000 people are showing up, they're probably showing up because they are unhappy about something. They may temporarily believe a certain proposition that turns out later not to be true, and then they drop out. They may not stay in a movement like Fannie Lou Hamer for year after year after year after year, getting jailed and coming out of jail. Most of these nonviolent movements that have won rights, people pay costs. They take risks and they pay costs. You know, they end up, it's a struggle. That's the definition of the word. That's astroturfing. Gentleman back there.
So, the idea of fueling violence...
Can't hear you, I'm sorry.
Should I go up there?
Just walk forward a little bit.
Okay. The idea of fueling violence is that peace achieved through violence is sustainable with violence. So basically, I think that people feel comfortable with governments like the United States government on account that we're defended against potential threats. And people take solace in the fact that we have an active military to protect us, so to speak. Now, how does a nonviolent society that creates itself by actively resisting a government figurehead that says that we will fight wars? Like right now, we're kind of our own nonviolent society. We've all come together with the knowledge that we believe in peace. So I know that no one here in this room believes in war. How do we defend ourselves against internal violent uprisings without an individual commitment to peace by each of our group's constituents?
Well, I'm not sure that, I'll take that last part of your question first. I'm not sure that one has to have an ethical attachment to the idea of nonviolence to know that violence in society is a very bad idea because it creates instability, it diminishes your own rights, it probably it's not good for the economy. There are a lot of practical reasons to not want to live in a violent society. I mentioned struggles against social violence. Gave a workshop in Guatemala a couple of years ago, a number of whose participants face social violence every day. Their government is democratic. The problem is the organized gangs in Guatemala have independent military power, they have lots of guns, they kidnap women and take them into sexual trafficking and sell them for a profit. So if you're a villager in Guatemala, your daughter might be kidnapped, you may never see her again. Those people are ready to be organized. They are organizing themselves. There are campaigns against social violence in Central America and Equatorial Africa and elsewhere in the world because of the problem of transnational trafficking. So it doesn't make any difference if the government is democratic, that problem can still occur. It does mean the government isn't enforcing the law. It means the government isn't preventing that trafficking. It probably means the government is being bought off by the traffickers. So you can have concrete personal reasons for not wanting violence without necessarily having a cosmic attachment to the idea of peace. But to the first part of your question, the difficulty that anti-war movements have had in open societies, where there's plenty of political space in which to organize, is that they fail to develop propositions which attract majority support. In the United States, that happened once in the last 100 years. There was a pacifist opposition to American participation in World War I and in World War II. Very tiny numbers were interested in that. It grew out of the opposition to conscription in the military draft. The Vietnam War, however, through the impact of conscription in the 1960s and early 1970s, the military draft, affected the majority of American families. And that war was well covered by the news media in the personal costs that young men and women were paying in Vietnam. At one point, there were 500,000 American troops in Vietnam. There were never more. For a year, there were 150,000 in Iraq, but that was when it was basically constabulary. The initial force which invaded Iraq was only about 50,000. So imagine 10 times the number of people involved in Iraq were in the Vietnam War. That affected the whole society. So, and I lived through this and participated in protests. There wasn't anyone of my generation in the 1960s and 1970s. There were very few who were not opposed to that war. That was manifested politically, it was manifested through mass demonstrations, it was manifested in a lot of different ways. And so the Nixon administration was forced to recognize that its strategy for continuing that war was not going to work. And then Nixon left anyway as a result of Watergate. And the Ford administration was much more politically practical and decided, this is not going to work, we have to get out of here. But they didn't decide to get out. They didn't decide to withdraw those troops because they were defeated on the battlefield. To that extent, conservatives are right. They withdrew them because there was no longer majority support for the war. It failed as a political proposition. I'm noting in the history of anti-war movements that sometimes those who participate in anti-war movements don't develop their discourse, their propositions for what they want in a way that resonates with the day-to-day lives of ordinary people. To use an old American political expression, this either works for Joe Lunchbucket or it doesn't. The working class is a wonderful litmus test for any movement or campaign in any societies. Movements sometimes come from students, sometimes they come from priests, sometimes they come from monks, as in Burma, sometimes they come from women who want their rights, or from these women whose sons and daughters are being kidnapped in Guatemala. But they better resonate with the working class. Because if the working class drops out, if the working class joins the movement, the economy can't function. And it's one of the biggest hurdles of student-based movements, or movements based on young people who are not workers. They have a difficulty developing, they're all inflamed about the issue and the righteousness and the justice of it all, but they're not explaining how this affects the lives of ordinary people. That didn't even happen in the opposition to the war in Vietnam, the opposition in the United States to the war in Vietnam. Even that wasn't done. It just so happened, though, that over time, a majority of the country just shifted its opinion against the war, and that's when the change occurred. Right here, this young lady.
I'm just wondering if the way you're presenting sort of the idea of creating organization, it's sort of a Western perspective, and I'm wondering how would this apply to conflicts who come from more egalitarian backgrounds? because the United States is really like we're a hierarchical structure, and if you were to apply the concept of justice across cultures, then what if someone's concept of justice is more like self-redress, and it's not a justice system, it's more individual, towards the individual, where they take justice into their own hands, which is why there's a lot of violent conflict we see in the East. So how would, I guess, your approach tackle that matter if cross-cultural perspectives of justice don't go in line with what you're saying?
You just framed a very articulate, even scholarly, conceptual provocation. But I would offer a different framing altogether. Look at this list again. Indians, Salvadorans, Argentinians, Chileans, Poles, Filipinos, Malians, Mongolians. Pretty diverse list. Right now, there are tribal people on the island of New Guinea and in the Andes Mountains. Don't have much in common with, don't understand any of the political ideas in the United States, and they've organized a movement. They've organized movements. Organizing something to fight for something that you believe is right, I would propose, is a natural human activity universally. Whatever form that may take, whatever discourse may be used. The choice between violence and nonviolent action doesn't need much explanation. You're either going to shoot somebody or you're going to take their power away from them. One of the two. If you can figure out a way to take their power away from them without shooting them, seems like you'd be taking fewer risks. Most people, when we do workshops around the world, they get that right away. So I don't think that abstract ideas about justice and freedom and rights have to be embedded, certainly not in Western terminology, in the language of all the diverse people who've used nonviolent action. Gandhi, I'm actually writing something on what I call the unifying proposition or the galvanizing proposition, and what are the elements of a proposition to get people to join your cause. Gandhi had a very coherent proposition. Didn't have anything to do with abstract notions of, liberal democracy or neoliberalism or old liberalism or any of those isms. He said, the British are running this country for their benefit. Why should we help them? Summing up both the source of discontent, they are ruling us not for our benefit, that's a lie, but so that they can take income back to the UK. And we're helping them, which suggests the strategy. Let's stop helping them. He said, we need to invite them to leave. They will leave if we invite them to leave. How do we invite them to leave? By not helping them get any income out of staying. That will be our invitation to them to leave. None of that involved any concepts of liberal democracy or political organization or any of that stuff. That was fundamentally human, very easily understood by tens of millions of illiterate Indians. I'm not going to give my consent any longer to this horrible system. I am going to go off on my own and do something else. I'm going to join this campaign or movement. So that would be my response to you. Yes, you have your hand up for a while. The microphone's coming.
So that's to put my question into context. I'm referring to Bobby Sands. I don't know if you are familiar with that name.
Bobby
Sands.
Sands?
Yeah, the hunger strikers in Northern Ireland in 1981.
Oh, yes.
My question from that is, does it take away the legitimacy of a nonviolent movement if the leaders of such a movement are former proponents of violence? In other words, were they only hunger striking because they didn't have a ski mask, a beret, and an AK-47 at their disposal? And second of all, how do you support a legitimate nonviolent movement like that when the other side of the argument, in that case being the unjust British rule in Northern Ireland, how do you reconcile? I guess what I'm saying is, like, you recognize that it's not really a legitimate nonviolent movement because these people don't have access to guns. But on the other side of that, Margaret Thatcher was, a refusal to give these people rights or see what's wrong in that regard. And I don't want to just apply that to Northern Ireland. I want to apply that to this greater concept of nonviolent movements. But I'm using that as a personal example because that's what I feel strongly about.
I understand your question. It's a good one. It often comes up in relation to Ireland, which is one of the mixed examples. Ireland is the two conflicts with which most nonviolent conflicts predominantly, well, let me put it this way. The two liberation struggles in the 20th century about which there's most controversy with respect to the use of violent or nonviolent methods or their mixture are Ireland and South Africa. We take the position, the majority of scholars take the position, that the resistance in South Africa was mass-based and predominantly nonviolent, that the armed wing of the ANC, that physically what it accomplished by itself would not have brought about the change, and that the change in South Africa was done primarily nonviolently. That can't be said about the struggle for Irish independence. But you've described the context for the hunger strike in question well, and you've also described the dilemma as it would present itself to those engaging in resistance to British rule of Northern Ireland very well. And so to the first half of your question, which is essentially, does the fact that those who are using a nonviolent tactic have not, does the fact that they have not forsworn violence jeopardize the legitimacy of their use of nonviolent tactics? That's one way of slightly restating your question. Does it make their use of nonviolent tactics less effective? That depends, and I'll tell you how, on what it depends. It depends on what lots of people around that specific tactic are doing. If the use of a nonviolent tactic shows that most people in the society who may be supporting that hunger striker, for example, are also have a will to resist, then it may not necessarily jeopardize the legitimacy of that particular user that in the past he used violence or that he hasn't forsworn the use of violence. The way you see this today, the place you see this most today is in Palestine, on the West Bank. There are a lot of people who have set aside violent resistance to the Israelis and are now using civil resistance. They have not, on principle, said that they are rejecting violence. They've just stopped using it. What is the best test of effectiveness is whether they can get people to join them. People are joining them because what they're doing now is effective. And so success is helpful. And so these little local campaigns in the West Bank, even by people who used to be violent, are nevertheless successful in organizing and mobilizing people. So it's not a complete, it doesn't completely jeopardize a movement to use nonviolent tactics just because some of the people in that movement, or even those same people in the past, may have used violence. If you go back and forth constantly between violent and nonviolent tactics, then you do run into jeopardizing the movement, because what you're then doing is and the greatest jeopardy is to the outside audience. And in the case of Northern Ireland, the outside audience is the British people generally. What do they believe about the conflict? If they see periodic violence, if they see bombings in London, if they see bombings in Manchester, then they think this is a illegitimate cause, it's violent revolutionaries, we're not going to put any pressure on our government to reconsider their policies in Northern Ireland. But if they see ordinary people engaging in resistance, they'll begin to have a problem. There's a debate today in Israel because of mass nonviolent resistance to the Israeli Defense Force in the West Bank. Great question. This debate could go on the rest of the afternoon, or this discussion on the basis of just this question. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that very inspiring lecture. Like Jack said, we could go on for forever, and I can still listen to all of this and take notes for myself and learn, and I know you have learned a lot. From my students, I expect not that you would know everything about nonviolence now. I expect great papers now. Jack, did you want to say something about the books and the documentary? Yes. Well, go ahead. Okay, so we have, Jack has brought books, you know, they Force More Powerful, and also documentaries that has been put together. These are like 6 different episodes of documentaries about different, okay, go.
Anybody who asks a question gets a free book and a free DVD. And after they run out, just ask me for a business card and I'll send you both the 3 documentaries we've done on various resistance movements, as well as the book of Force More Powerful.
Thank you. So they're available, they're in the back room, and so please get the book and also documentaries. You will be, it's very inspiring.